Number 10. The Holy League coalitions and shared instability. Some alliances are remembered as noble coalitions formed against a common threat. The darker reality is that leagues built from fear often carry instability inside them from the very beginning. That is what makes the Holy League pattern so unsettling. On paper, these coalitions looked like instruments of shared defense, moments when separate powers recognized a danger large enough to force cooperation. But alliances formed under intense pressure do not erase distrust. They suspend it. Each member enters with its own priorities, its own fears, its own ambitions, and its own calculation of what victory should look like. The result is a political structure that can appear unified in public while remaining unstable underneath. What gave such coalitions their strength also created their danger. They brought together states that might not naturally trust one another, and that meant every military success, every strategic decision, and every diplomatic negotiation could reopen hidden tensions among the partners themselves. One member might want total confrontation, another containment, another prestige, another territorial gain, another simple survival. The alliance survives by presenting common purpose, but common purpose in war does not always produce common interest in outcome. The very moment that should confirm unity can instead sharpen suspicion, because success raises the question of who benefits most from the sacrifice of all. That is what makes these coalitions feel so dark. They are not simply fragile because enemies attack them from outside. They are fragile because the bond holding them together is often thinner than it appears. Shared danger can create cooperation, but it can also create dependency, resentment, and mutual anxiety. Smaller partners may fear being used. Larger partners may fear hesitation or betrayal. Every member needs the alliance, yet no member can fully control what the alliance will become once the balance inside it begins to shift. A coalition meant to preserve freedom can become a source of strategic entanglement so intense that its own members begin to feel trapped inside the logic of collective survival. The deeper lesson is that alliances forged in crisis are often strongest at the moment of greatest danger and weakest the moment they begin imagining what comes after. That is why the Holy League pattern belongs on this list. These coalitions could be effective, even formidable, but they also reveal how quickly shared defense can become shared instability. The enemy may stand outside the alliance, yet the structure itself begins generating strain from within. And once that happens, each member must confront a terrifying possibility. The partnership protecting them today may become one of the forces destabilizing them tomorrow. Number 9. The League of Corinth, after Alexander. Some alliances are dangerous because they are too weak to hold together. The League of Corinth is darker because it was dangerous, precisely because it remained tied to the overwhelming power of one dominant center. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The League was supposed to organize the Greek world into a common political and military framework under Macedonian leadership. On the surface, it offered order, unity, and the promise that long-fractured states could be directed toward a larger purpose. But once an alliance depends too heavily on the authority of one extraordinary ruler, the death of that ruler turns the whole structure into a test of whether unity was ever truly shared at all. What gave the League of Corinth its force also created its vulnerability. It worked because Macedonian supremacy was real, and under Alexander that supremacy was backed not only by armies, but by charisma, momentum, and unparalleled success. Smaller states could remain inside the framework because the cost of resisting the center was too high, and because the larger project of conquest gave the alliance a sense of movement and inevitability. But that kind of cohesion is perilous. It does not necessarily rest on deep trust between members. It rests on the continued dominance of the hegemon. Once Alexander was gone, the League no longer stood in the shadow of one commanding presence. It stood in the shadow of his absence. That is what makes the aftermath so dark. An alliance built to stabilize the Greek world became more dangerous to its members because it no longer had a clear center capable of commanding obedience with the same certainty. The framework remained, but the power relationships inside it became more unstable. Greek states that had submitted under pressure could begin rethinking their position. Macedonian authority still mattered, yet it was now entangled in succession struggles, competing ambitions, and the broader uncertainty that followed Alexander's death. The League no longer represented merely coordination. It represented exposure. To stay inside it meant remaining bound to a system whose future had become unpredictable. To challenge it meant risking the violence of a power structure still strong enough to punish defiance. The darker lesson is that alliances organized under a dominant ruler can appear durable while that ruler lives, only to reveal their fragility the moment personal supremacy disappears. That is why the League of Corinth takes this place on the list. It shows how a coalition can become dangerous, not because its members suddenly forget its purpose, but because that purpose was never independent of the hegemon who held it together. Once Alexander was gone, the alliance became something more ominous. A political shell still carrying the pressure of Macedonian control, but no longer stabilized by the same force that had made obedience seem inevitable. And in that gap between structure and certainty, the members of the League found themselves inside a system that could no longer fully protect them, yet could still threaten them. Number 8. The Triple Alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Some alliances become dangerous because they are weak and unstable. This one is darker because it was strong enough to conquer, extract, and dominate, yet unequal enough that the balance inside it always carried the potential for internal danger. That is what makes the Triple Alliance so unsettling. On the surface, it was a partnership among three major powers that helped reshape central Mexico and build one of the most formidable imperial structures of its age. It offered military coordination, political advantage, and a framework through which victory could be organized and rewards distributed. But alliances built on unequal power do not remain neutral for long. Over time, the strongest member begins to define what the alliance means, while the weaker members are forced to live inside a system that still speaks the language of partnership, even as real control becomes less evenly shared. What gave the alliance its force also created its danger. Expansion brought wealth, tribute, prestige, and the practical benefits of coordinated power. But conquest also changed the internal chemistry of the coalition. The more tribute flowed, the more important the question became of who truly commanded the system that gathered it. The more victories accumulated, the more obvious it became which member stood closest to the center of real authority. A league can survive unequal influence for a time, especially when success keeps rewarding everyone. But success itself can deepen imbalance. One partner becomes indispensable, another becomes dependent, and another risks being reduced to a name preserved in the structure more than a force shaping it. The alliance still exists, yet membership no longer means equal political weight. That is what makes this case feel so dark. To remain inside such a coalition is to benefit from its victories while gradually losing the ability to shape its direction. Smaller or less dominant members may still share in prestige and spoils, but they also become tied to a system whose military energy, tribute logic, and imperial ambition are being driven more and more by the strongest power. The alliance protects them, but it also absorbs them. It enlarges their influence, but only within a framework that makes it harder to resist the center. And once an alliance reaches that stage, it stops being merely cooperative. It becomes a hierarchy that still wears the mask of shared purpose. The deeper lesson is that some alliances are most dangerous, not when they begin to fail, but when they begin to succeed too well under uneven leadership. That is why the Triple Alliance belongs here. It reveals how a coalition can remain outwardly functional while quietly becoming more hazardous to the autonomy of its own members. The greatest danger is not always betrayal in the open sense. Sometimes it is the slow transformation of alliance into dominance, until one day the partners realize they are no longer standing beside a common structure. They are standing inside someone else's empire. Number 7. The Hanseatic League's competitive frictions. Some alliances are born in war and held together by fear. The Hanseatic world is darker because its dangers emerge through competition inside a network that was supposed to protect mutual economic strength. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The League was not an empire in the ordinary sense, and not a kingdom ruled from one throne. It was a commercial alliance, a web of cities and trading interests that gained power through coordination, privileges, and shared influence across Northern Europe. On paper, that made it look flexible, intelligent, and mutually beneficial. But networks built on commerce can become dangerous to their own members when cooperation and competition are never fully separable. Every city benefits from collective strength, while also trying to secure the best position for itself. What gave the Hanseatic League its force also planted the seeds of tension. Its power depended on trust, shared interests, negotiated privileges, and the ability of separate urban centers to act together when needed. Yet those same cities were also commercial rivals. They competed for roots, influence, profit, local advantage, and leverage within the very system that tied them together. A military alliance can sometimes identify its enemy clearly. A trading league often cannot because the danger is woven into everyday self-interest. The same partner who helps defend common privileges may also be the rival trying to dominate the most profitable exchange, bend decisions toward its own advantage, or weaken competitors inside the alliance itself. That is what makes the Hanseatic case feel so dark. The League did not need a single tyrannical center to become hazardous. Its internal danger came from frictions that were built into the structure. Members needed one another, but they also needed to outperform one another. They wanted common strength, but not at the price of losing local advantage. They wanted unity, but only the kind of unity that did not obstruct their own prosperity. Over time, those tensions could turn the alliance into a field of constant negotiation where collective power survived only through unstable compromise. The League remained useful, but usefulness is not the same as harmony. Beneath the commercial brilliance was a permanent strain between solidarity and self-preservation. The darker lesson is that alliances based on shared profit can become dangerous in quieter, more corrosive ways than alliances built for war. They do not always explode into open collapse. They wear down through friction, mistrust, and strategic competition among the very members who keep claiming common purpose. That is why the Hanseatic League takes this place on the list. It shows that an alliance does not need conquest, coercion, or imperial hierarchy to become threatening to its own members. Sometimes it becomes dangerous because every partner is rational, ambitious, and determined to win inside the same structure that is supposed to protect them all. Number 6. The Aetolian League's opportunistic strains. Some alliances become dangerous because they are captured by one dominant power. The Aetolian League is darker because its danger grew out of a more unstable habit: opportunism inside a coalition that was supposed to provide collective strength. That is what makes the case so unsettling. On the surface, the League could look energetic, adaptable, and politically agile, a federation capable of turning regional cooperation into influence. But adaptability can become something more dangerous when it hardens into a pattern of strategic opportunism, because members begin to live inside an alliance whose direction is never entirely secure. The League may still act in the name of common interest, yet the meaning of that common interest keeps shifting with circumstance, ambition, and advantage. What gave the Aetolian League its force also created its tension. It had room for maneuver. It could respond to changing conditions, make use of openings, and position itself in a competitive Greek world where rigid passivity often meant weakness. That flexibility made it formidable. But flexibility also carries a hidden cost when the alliance stops feeling anchored by durable, shared purpose. Members may begin to suspect that policy is being driven less by stable collective interest than by tactical calculation, short-term leverage, or the ambitions of leaders who thrive in fluid conditions. In that kind of environment, the alliance becomes harder to trust even when it remains useful. It can still protect its members, but it can also expose them to decisions made in the spirit of opportunity rather than long-term security. That is what makes the Aetolian case feel so dark. Opportunism can look like brilliance while success continues. It can generate gains, preserve relevance, and keep a league moving in a dangerous political landscape. Yet it also teaches members a troubling lesson. The alliance may not stand for anything solid beyond its own ability to exploit the moment. Once that impression spreads, internal strain becomes unavoidable. Some members may welcome aggressive maneuvering, while others may fear that the League is drawing them into conflicts whose benefits are uneven and whose risks are shared. A coalition begins as a shield, but under opportunistic pressure, it can become a mechanism through which some members are repeatedly asked to gamble more than they would choose on their own. The deeper lesson is that alliances do not need obvious tyranny to become threatening. They can become dangerous when their internal culture rewards movement without stability, ambition without trust, and tactical gain without deep cohesion. That is why the Aetolian League belongs on this list. Its story suggests a federation whose strength was real, yet whose very agility could produce unease inside the system it was meant to sustain. The danger did not come only from enemies outside the alliance. It came from the growing possibility that the alliance itself might carry its members from one calculated opportunity to the next, until strategy and instability became almost impossible to separate. Number 5, the Lombard League's internal rivalries. Some alliances are endangered by outside enemies more powerful than any one member could resist alone. The Lombard League is darker because even while it served as a defensive coalition, it still had to contain the rivalries of the very cities bound together inside it. That is what makes the case so unsettling. On the surface, the League represented collective resistance, a political arrangement through which separate urban powers could cooperate against a greater external pressure. But city leagues are rarely made of neutral partners. They are made of proud communities with their own ambitions, histories, jealousies, and calculations. The alliance gives them a common cause, but it does not erase the rivalry that existed before the cause appeared. What gave the Lombard League its strength also created its danger. Its members brought resources, determination, and local power into a shared structure, which made the coalition more resilient than any isolated city might have been. Yet the same cities also had reasons to compete: influence within the League, prestige, commercial advantage, regional standing, and the right to shape policy. Cooperation was necessary, but necessity does not dissolve rivalry. It merely forces rivalry to operate under the language of unity. That is where the danger begins. Once an alliance must constantly balance common defense against internal competition among its own members, every success and every sacrifice risks reopening the question of who is gaining most and who is yielding too much. That is what makes the Lombard League feel so dark. It was not simply a matter of whether the coalition could resist external domination. It was also a matter of whether its own members could keep their internal rivalries from corroding the very solidarity that made resistance possible. A league of ambitious cities can never fully escape the politics of comparison. Which city leads? Which city benefits? Which city bears the burden? Which city is quietly turning collective struggle into its own advantage? These are not minor concerns. They are the kinds of questions that can transform allies into suspicious partners even while they remain formally united. The alliance survives, but it survives under the pressure of constant internal negotiation. The darker lesson is that a coalition built for defense can become hazardous to its own members when rivalry remains active inside the structure that is supposed to contain it. That is why the Lombard League takes this place on the list. It shows how alliances do not become dangerous only when they collapse or are captured by a single hegemon. They can also become dangerous when every member still wants the alliance, yet no member fully stops competing with the others inside it. In that world, the enemy outside may be real, but so is the corrosive force of ambition within. And over time, an alliance asked to carry both solidarity and rivalry at once can begin to feel less like a refuge than like a tense political arena from which no member can safely step away. Number 4. The Latin League before Roman absorption. Some alliances become dangerous because they collapse into open conflict. The Latin League is darker because the danger grew inside a partnership whose members were still close enough in culture, geography, and political life to imagine themselves as part of a shared world. That is what makes the case so unsettling. On the surface, the League represented cooperation among Latin communities that faced overlapping threats and interests. It offered a framework for mutual defense, coordinated action, and regional stability in a world where isolation could be costly. But alliances among near equals carry a hidden danger when one member begins to outgrow the structure. The closer the relationship, the more destabilizing it becomes when partnership starts turning into hierarchy. What gave the Latin League its strength also created its vulnerability. Its members were bound not only by necessity but by a degree of kinship, proximity, and political familiarity that made cooperation feel plausible and even natural. Yet that very closeness raised the stakes of imbalance. As Rome expanded in strength, military capacity, and political confidence, the League could no longer remain a simple arrangement among comparable partners. The alliance still carried the language of shared interest, but the material reality was changing. One city was becoming too powerful to remain merely first among equals, while the others were forced to confront a dangerous question. What happens when the strongest member of a league no longer needs the league in the same way as everyone else? That is what makes the Latin League feel so dark. The danger did not come only from betrayal in the obvious sense. It came from structural transformation. Smaller members could remain inside the alliance, but doing so increasingly meant living within a system whose future was being shaped by Rome's rise. To resist that rise was perilous, because Rome was becoming strong enough to punish defiance. To accept it was also perilous, because acceptance meant watching the alliance drift toward absorption. The League still existed, but it had begun to turn into a transitional space between cooperation and domination. It protected its members only so long as they could ignore the fact that one partner was outgrowing the terms of common membership. The darker lesson is that alliances among related powers can become most dangerous when one member stops seeing shared structure as the end goal and starts treating it as a step towards something larger. That is why the Latin League belongs here. Its story reveals how a coalition can become hazardous, not because its members stop needing unity, but because unity itself is gradually redefined by the ambitions of the strongest participant. What began as a league of Latin partners moved toward a reality in which Rome would no longer remain simply a member. And once that shift became irreversible, the alliance ceased to be a shield of equals. It became part of the process by which one city drew the others into its expanding orbit. Number 3. The Aztec Triple Alliance's unequal power. Some alliances become dangerous because they fail to coordinate effectively. This one is darker because it coordinated with immense success while quietly reproducing a balance of power that was never truly equal. That is what makes the Aztec Triple Alliance so unsettling. On paper, it was a partnership, a coalition among major centers that could combine force, distribute rewards, and sustain a wider imperial order. It offered military effectiveness, political leverage, and access to tribute on a scale that no member might have achieved alone. But alliances that speak in the language of shared victory can become threatening when the victories themselves keep strengthening one member more than the others. Success does not always stabilize a partnership. Sometimes it magnifies the hierarchy hidden inside it. What gave the alliance its strength also created its danger. Campaigns produced tribute, prestige, and a wider political world organized around the coalition's dominance. Yet every expansion raised the question of how power inside the alliance was actually being distributed. The more central the strongest member became to warfare, extraction, and imperial identity, the less plausible the idea of balanced partnership remained. The alliance still functioned, but not as a structure in which all members carried equal weight. It increasingly revolved around the gravitational pull of the dominant power. That is the subtle danger of unequal alliances. They do not need to formally dissolve in order to stop being equal. They only need one member to become increasingly indispensable. That is what makes this case feel so dark. The weaker or less central members could still benefit from remaining inside the coalition, but benefit is not the same as security. To stay within the alliance meant accepting a system whose logic was being shaped elsewhere. To challenge that logic meant confronting the strongest force inside the very structure that was supposed to protect all participants. Over time, the alliance becomes harder to distinguish from hierarchy itself. Its language remains cooperative, its rituals remain collective, and its victories remain shared in appearance. Yet the political reality is that one member is setting the terms under which the others continue to exist within it. The deeper lesson is that some alliances become dangerous, not because they are broken, but because they work too well under unequal conditions. That is why the Aztec Triple Alliance takes this place on the list. It shows how a coalition can remain outwardly successful while inwardly becoming a mechanism through which dominance hardens into structure. The members do not suddenly become enemies. The danger is more subtle than that. They remain allies within a system that is gradually reducing some of them from partners to participants in someone else's ascent. And once an alliance reaches that point, its weaker members are no longer simply protected by it. They are being shaped, constrained, and overshadowed by it at the same time. Number 2. The Peloponnesian League's Spartan burden. Some alliances become dangerous because one dominant member abuses the partnership openly. The Peloponnesian League is darker because its danger emerged through a structure that could still look functional, legitimate, and strategically necessary, even while the weight of Spartan leadership was becoming a burden to those inside it. That is what makes the case so unsettling. On the surface, the League offered order, military coordination, and a powerful counterbalance in the Greek world. It gave its members the protection of association with Sparta, the prestige of belonging to a formidable coalition, and the practical benefits of standing inside a system feared by rivals. But alliances centered on one military hegemon always carry a hidden tension. The stronger the leader, the harder it becomes to tell where shared strategy ends and imposed obedience begins. What gave the Peloponnesian League its force also created its danger. Sparta's military reputation, discipline, and political weight gave the alliance cohesion that many looser coalitions could never achieve. Members could rely on the League because Spartan leadership made collective action credible. Yet that same credibility rested on inequality. The system worked because Sparta mattered more than everyone else. Its priorities carried greater force, its judgment shaped common policy, and its expectations could pull allied states into wars, obligations, or postures they might not have chosen on their own. Protection and pressure grew from the same source. To remain under Spartan leadership was to gain security, but also to accept a structure in which the strongest members' fears and ambitions could become binding on everyone else. That is what makes the Peloponnesian League feel so dark. The danger was not simply that Sparta led. The danger was that the logic of the alliance increasingly required others to live inside Sparta's strategic worldview. A smaller member might benefit from the League's military shield, yet that shield came with political cost. To stay within the coalition meant sharing in the burdens of Spartan rivalry, Spartan caution, Spartan severity, and Spartan calculations about the wider Greek balance of power. The alliance did not have to collapse for that burden to become dangerous. It only had to keep functioning long enough for members to realize that their own autonomy was being narrowed by the very partnership meant to preserve their security. The deeper lesson is that hegemonic alliances often become hazardous not when leadership fails, but when leadership succeeds so completely that it defines reality for everyone inside the system. That is why the Peloponnesian League belongs near the top of this list. It reveals how an alliance can remain militarily formidable while becoming politically heavy for its own members. The strongest partner keeps the structure stable, but that stability is purchased through dependence, reduced freedom, and the constant risk that collective strategy will become indistinguishable from submission to the hegemon's will. In that world, the alliance still protects. It also confines, and that is what makes it dangerous. Number 1. The Delian League under Athenian control. Some alliances begin as voluntary partnerships and only later reveal what they are truly becoming. The Delian League is darker than almost any other case because it shows, with terrifying clarity, how a coalition formed for common defense can gradually transform into a structure that becomes dangerous to the autonomy of nearly everyone inside it. That is what makes the case so chilling. At the beginning, the League could be understood as a shared response to external threat, a system through which Greek states coordinated resources and power for mutual security. It spoke the language of alliance, contribution, and common purpose. But alliances do not remain what they were at birth if one member learns how to turn leadership into control. What gave the Delian League its strength also created its fatal danger. Athens brought naval power, energy, prestige, and strategic capability on a scale that made the League effective. It could organize collective action, protect sea routes, and project force in ways smaller allies could not manage alone. That success made Athenian leadership seem indispensable. Yet indispensability is precisely where alliance begins to darken into domination. Once the coalition depended too much on Athens, the question of whether allies were truly free became harder to answer honestly. Contributions could become obligations. Membership could become entrapment. Shared defense could become a mechanism through which the leading city accumulated the wealth, coercive capacity, and confidence to discipline the very states that had once joined as partners. That is what makes the Delian League so disturbing. The danger did not appear as a sudden betrayal that everyone could immediately recognize. It emerged through transformation. The alliance kept functioning. Ships still sailed, tributes still flowed, the language of collective security still existed. But beneath that continuity, the structure had changed. Athens was no longer merely coordinating the League. It was increasingly defining it, using it, and reshaping it around Athenian power. For member states, this created an impossible tension. To remain inside the League meant living within an order that was becoming less voluntary over time. To resist meant confronting the strongest naval force inside the alliance itself. The very mechanism that once promised protection had become the instrument through which Athens could punish independence. That is why the Delian League takes the number 1 place on this list. Its story captures the darkest truth about alliances. The greatest danger does not always come when an alliance fails. Sometimes it comes when an alliance succeeds so completely under one dominant member that it ceases to be an alliance in any meaningful equal sense at all. The shield becomes a chain. The partnership becomes an empire in all but name. And by the time the smaller members fully understand what has happened, the structure around them is already too strong to escape without cost. That is what makes the Delian League so haunting. It is not just the story of allies cooperating. It is the story of cooperation slowly hardening into control until the members of the alliance find that the power they helped build has become the power that now rules them.